All right, foundational philosophies of the United States. We're going to talk about this a little today. I tried finding some videos on this, but nothing was quite what I wanted, and they were all super boring, more boring than I am. So we're going to give this a go. Here's the state standards. Um, this is basically a debate. We could do a debate sometime when we're all back in class, but for now, you get a lecture. What we're going to talk about today: John Locke, social compact, Montesquieu, separation of powers, and checks and balances. This is all a prelude to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and what the founding fathers believed as they were setting about creating this great experiment. So the Enlightenment period. This was a period 17th century to the 19th century, so roughly 1600s to the 1800s, mostly in Europe, revolved around learning and reasoning as the key to solving society's problems. This was a departure from the church, and it relied heavily on science and philosophy. Um, think about the world in a rational setting and how can problems in the world be solved by thinking them through rather than reliance on divine power. John Locke, he was one of the big names back then, 17th century philosopher. Social compact, we're going to talk about that a little bit, and natural law. Natural law is different than natural rights. He distinguished natural rights as life, liberty, and property. If you've done the Declaration of Independence assignment, you've heard it phrased a little differently: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke, life, liberty, and property, meaning your estate, where you lived, your house, your home. Natural law is the laws that we would come up with as we live in proximity to each other. So as soon as you have a neighbor, you have to figure out how you're going to live with that neighbor, right? Like where your property is, where his is, where yours ends, what you're allowed to do on that property. That's the kind of the natural law. It's not a government yet. It's just people figuring out how to live together. Which brings us to the social compact. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he expanded on that a little bit on the idea of a social compact to include governments. And governments are instituted by the people and derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Consent of the governed basically means that the government exists only because we, the people, allow it to exist. We give the authority to the government to make certain rules so that we can live peacefully together amongst each other. And with those, they can oversee those rules. Now, one of the things that we're giving up when we allow the government, we provide the government authority to rule over us, is vigilante justice, meaning we can't take justice into our own hands. If we're creating an authority to handle that justice, then we have to allow that justice system to work. And if you've been paying attention to the news, you'll see that this is breaking down. We'll talk about it a little bit at the end of this. So Montesquieu, he was another philosopher back in the 1700s, and he discussed the separation of powers. Separation of powers is another idea where with the old parliament system in England, which we broke away from, they had all the power. They could legislate the laws. They created the laws. They judged the laws. They were actually a judicial system in themselves, where if you had a complaint against somebody, you would take it to Parliament, and they would judge how that complaint goes. They also had the executive power of they could enforce the laws. These were abdicated by the king at the time, the monarch at the time, gave Parliament some of these powers, or allowed Parliament to have those powers. But before the Parliament, it was all in the hands of the king. It was one branch, no separation. In our system, We have separate branches. We have the legislative branch, which makes the laws. That's Congress, the House, and the Senate. We have the executive branch. That's the presidency. That includes the Justice Department, the Department of Justice, as well as the FBI, the ATF, all of those law enforcement departments. And then the judicial. You see the Supreme Court all the time in the news, judging laws, and that's where we go to have our cases heard and our trials if we commit a criminal offense. And this little diagram here basically shows the checks and balances. That was another principle which allows each branch of government to limit the power of the other branches. So, for instance, Congress, they've got what's called the power of the purse, and they create the budget. And the budget, the money is used by the president to run the country, to enforce the laws. The legislative branch itself can't enforce laws, they just make the laws. So they have to rely on the federal branch. Now, the federal branch could decide that those laws are less important than other laws and choose to assign resources elsewhere to enforce other laws. They can't actually ignore the law. The Supreme Court has ruled on that. But they can set a distinction on which laws are going to take precedence. They can put a hierarchy on the laws that they're going to enforce. So the legislature can pass a law, and the executive has veto power. Means he can not sign the bill, send it back to Congress. Maybe there's something that needs to be fixed. Maybe he doesn't feel that the law is just. So before it gets signed into law, you can send it back. Or if it is signed into law, the people can take that to court, and the Supreme Court can decide if it's a constitutional law or not. That's happened quite a few times. But a check against the Supreme Court is that the president assigns judges. He nominates judges, and the Senate, the Congress, approves those judges. So there's checks and balances all over the place. No one branch of government can hold ultimate power over another branch. It's like a three-legged stool. If you take one away, then the stool will collapse. If you take one leg away, the stool will collapse. But if you just shorten one, you just get a little wobbly. You don't completely fall down. All right, so why is this topical? Right now, our social compact is breaking down. If you've been following the news and saw what happened in, say, Kenosha, Wisconsin over the last couple of days, there was a man who was shot, and a lot of people believe he was shot by the police. A lot of people believe it was an unjust shooting. Remember, justice means fairness, so it wasn't fair. So they're protesting out. Amongst the protesters are agitators who are rioting. And the protests are fine, but the agitators in there that are rioting and destroying property breaks that social compact. And the police, the government, is seen to be sitting on the sidelines. So you see people are taking the law into their own hands, and they're protecting the property or attempting to protect the property. And it all came to a head last night where you had protesters, you had agitators, and you had people protecting their property. And there was another shooting. So right now, this social compact that we have with our government, where we abdicate some of our protection to the government's not protecting us. So some people in some parts of this country are taking it upon themselves to protect their own selves and their own property. Remember, there's state, John Locke's life, liberty, and property. Meanwhile, people are protesting against what they feel is an unjust government, a government that's not only not protecting them, but actively going out to harm them. And it's just all breaking down at the moment. So understanding these philosophies, this is something that went back all the way back to the 16th century, and it's coming up today. And this is why we study history, because when we can see it, we see it in the past, and we can understand what's happening today. And that's about it. So if you have any questions, please ask. And thank you.